Imagine, if you will, a time when the Mediterranean was not yet Roman, when the Great Sea was divided between powers that spoke different tongues, worshipped different gods, and dreamed different dreams of empire. In this ancient world, where the scent of cedar and salt carried on warm winds, where marble was still being carved and bronze still rang against bronze, there lived a man whose very name would become synonymous with terror. His name was Hannibal. Picture him now, not as the marble statue history has made him, but as a child standing on the shores of North Africa, watching ships with purple sails disappear beyond the horizon. The sand was warm beneath his feet, and the Mediterranean stretched endlessly blue before him. But in those young eyes burned something that would one day shake the very foundations of Rome. But before we begin this journey through shadow and snow, through triumph and tragedy, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Leave a comment and tell us what other fascinating stories from the ancient world you'd love to hear whispered into the night. Now, dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes and listen as we walk together through the corridors of time to an age when a single man's dream nearly brought the greatest empire the world had ever known to its knees. Let us begin. The Mediterranean wind carries many things: salt from the waves, the cry of gulls, the whisper of ancient promises. But on this particular evening, as the sun melted like honey over the North African coast, it carried something else: the weight of destiny. Young Hannibal Barca stood in the temple of Melkart, his small hand dwarfed by his father's calloused grip. The boy was 9 years old, with dark eyes that reflected the flickering temple flames like obsidian mirrors. Before them lay the sacred altar, still warm with the smoke of sacrifice, and around them the shadows of Carthage's greatest warriors seemed to lean in, listening. Hamilcar Barca, his father, was a man carved from the same bronze as the statues that lined the temple walls. His beard was streaked with premature silver, not from age, but from the weight of carrying his people's hopes through defeat after defeat. The Romans had humiliated Carthage in the First Great War, demanding tribute that would bleed the city white for generations. But here, in this sacred space where gods and mortals met, something was being born that would echo through centuries. "Place your hand upon the altar, my son." Hamilcar's voice was soft, barely louder than the Mediterranean breeze that whispered through the temple's columns. The stone was still warm from the day's sacrifices, rough beneath the boy's palm. The scent of frankincense hung heavy in the air, mixing with the salt from the distant harbor and the metallic tang that always seemed to cling to soldiers returning from campaign. Outside, Carthage hummed with the sounds of evening. Merchants calling their wares, children playing in dusty streets, the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor walls, where ships rocked like sleeping giants. "Swear to me," Hamilcar continued, his eyes fixed not on his son but on something far beyond the temple walls, perhaps seeing across the sea to the 7 hills where Rome's eagles perched in victory. "Swear by all the gods of our fathers, by Melkart and Tanit, by the shade of Queen Dido herself, that you will never be Rome's friend." The words hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with meaning that the young boy could not yet fully grasp. But children often understand truth in ways that adults have forgotten, and something in Hannibal's chest tightened like a drawn bowstring. This was more than a promise. It was a passing of fire from one generation to the next. "I swear it, father." The boy's voice was steady, though his hand trembled slightly against the ancient stone. "I will never be Rome's friend." In that moment, as the last light of day painted the temple walls the color of dried blood, something shifted in the world. It was subtle, like the first crack in a dam or the first spark in dry grass. The gods, if they were listening, might have smiled at the irony that Rome's greatest terror would be born not from the clash of armies or the schemes of kings, but from a father's love and a boy's solemn promise in a darkened temple. Hamilcar placed his other hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the small bones beneath, so fragile and yet destined to carry such weight. He thought of his own defeats, of watching Roman ships carry away Carthaginian silver, of the treaties signed in shame, and the nights spent staring at maps, dreaming of roads not taken. "You are Barca," he whispered, using the word that meant lightning in their ancient tongue. "You are the storm that will break upon their walls." Outside, the muezzin's call drifted across the city, though the god they called to bore a different name in those days. The sound mixed with the creaking of ship masts and the distant laughter of children, all the sounds of a living city, a people who refused to believe that their greatest days were behind them. As father and son walked from the temple into the cooling evening air, neither could have imagined the path that oath would carve through history. They could not see the snow-covered peaks that waited in the distance, or the elephants that would one day trumpet their rage across frozen passes. They could not hear the screams that would echo across Italian battlefields, or feel the trembling that would run through Rome's very foundations. But in the growing darkness of that North African night, as stars began to appear like scattered diamonds across the sky, something had been set in motion that would not rest until either Carthage rose again or Rome learned what it truly meant to fear. The boy walked beside his father through streets that smelled of spices and leather, of olive oil, and the distant salt of the sea. His hand still tingled from touching the altar stone, and his mind turned over the words he had spoken like smooth stones in a pouch. Already, though he did not know it, he was beginning to see the world differently, not as it was, but as it could be, reshaped by will and fury and the lightning that bore his name. In the harbour, ships creaked at anchor, their holds full of grain and silver, ivory and precious stones from the heart of Africa. Merchants from a dozen nations walked the docks, speaking in tongues that rose and fell like music. This was Carthage, not merely a city, but a dream of what the world could become when trade flowed freely and different peoples met in peace. But peace, young Hannibal was learning, was something that had to be fought for. And sometimes, the only way to preserve what you loved was to become the very thing your enemies feared most. The oath had been sworn, the die had been cast, and somewhere across the dark waters of the Mediterranean, Rome slept peacefully, unaware that its greatest nightmare was just beginning to dream. Time moves differently in memory, like honey poured from a golden jar. Days blend into seasons, seasons into years, and before we know it, the child has become something else entirely. 8 years had passed since that night in the temple, and the boy who swore his oath on warm stone had grown into something his enemies would not recognize as human. Spain stretched before them like a bronze shield, hammered flat by the gods themselves. The Iberian Peninsula in those days was a land of fierce tribes and fiercer winters, of silver mines that gleamed like stars and rivers that ran red with the mud of distant mountains. Here Hamilcar had brought his family to carve out a new empire from the bones of the old. And here young Hannibal learned that war was not glorious, it was simply necessary. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping giants. Hannibal, now 17 and tall for his age, stood beside his father on a ridge overlooking the enemy camp. Below them, the Olcades tribe had gathered their warriors, men painted with blue clay and armed with weapons passed down through generations of proud defeat. Their fires flickered like fallen stars in the grey dawn light. "What do you see, my son?" Hamilcar's voice carried the weight of years spent teaching the same lessons over and over. Watching boys become men, watching men become ghosts. Hannibal studied the scene below with eyes that had learned to see beyond the surface of things. Where once he might have seen only the romance of painted warriors and morning fires, now he saw patterns, weaknesses, opportunities. They've placed their camp between two hills, thinking the high ground will protect them. But see how the mist gathers in the valley. It will lift with the sun, and when it does, they'll be blinded by the light reflecting off our bronze. And they've drawn their water from the stream that runs past their eastern wall. If we circle north during the night and dam it upstream, by dawn they'll be fighting with dry mouths and the memory of water. Hamilcar smiled, but it was a complex expression, pride mixed with something sadder, the knowledge that each lesson learned was a small piece of innocence lost. You see like a general now, but tell me, what do you feel? The question caught Hannibal off guard. Feel? In the 8 years since leaving Carthage, feeling had become a luxury his father had systematically trained out of him. Warriors who felt too much hesitated. Hesitation meant death, and death meant the end of dreams that stretched far beyond these Spanish hills. But there in the morning mist with his father beside him and an enemy camp spread out like a gift below, Hannibal allowed himself a moment of honest reflection. I feel... He paused, searching for words to describe something that lived deeper than language. I feel like I'm becoming something I was always meant to be, but also like I'm losing something I can never get back. That's something you're losing, Hamilcar said quietly. That is the price of keeping your oath. Every general pays it. Every warrior who would reshape the world must learn to see people as pieces on a board, must learn to move those pieces even when they cry out in languages that once meant something to him. The sun was rising now, turning the mist to gold and the weapons below to points of fire. Soon the battle would begin, and it would be over quickly, not because the Olcades were poor fighters, but because Hannibal's mind had already fought and won it 3 different ways before the first spear was thrown. In the years that followed, this pattern would repeat itself across the length and breadth of Spain. Tribe after tribe would fall before the combination of Carthaginian discipline and Hannibal's growing genius for seeing victory where others saw only the terrible complexity of war. The Carpetani, the Vetonians, the Vacae. Each name would be added to the list of peoples who had learned too late what it meant to stand against the lightning. But it was not just victory that shaped him during those Spanish years. It was the understanding that war was an art form, and he was becoming its greatest artist. He learned to speak the languages of his enemies, not from any sense of courtesy, but because words, too, were weapons. He studied their customs, their fears, their sacred places, not from curiosity, but because knowledge was armor, and he intended to be invulnerable. The nights were perhaps the most crucial part of his education. While his soldiers slept around carefully maintained fires, Hannibal would walk among them, listening to their dreams and their nightmares, learning what drove men to follow orders that might lead to death. He discovered that loyalty was not something that could be commanded. It had to be earned, one small act of understanding at a time. There was the night after the siege of Saguntum, when he found a young soldier from Numidia, weeping over a letter from home. The boy's sister had died in childbirth, and he would never see her grave. Without a word, Hannibal sat beside him and waited until the tears were finished. Then he told the soldier about his own sister, who had laughed like silver bells and died of fever when she was 12. They sat together in silence until dawn, and when the sun rose, the Numidian would have followed Hannibal into the mouth of hell itself. These were the moments that transformed him from a general into something more dangerous, a leader who understood that the heart of war was not strategy or tactics, but the simple human need to believe that suffering had meaning. His soldiers began to speak of him in whispers, not because they feared him, but because they had begun to love him in the way that men love the gods. Desperately, completely, without reservation. By his 26th year, when the last Spanish tribe had bent the knee and sworn fealty to Carthage, Hannibal Barca had become something that Rome had never faced before, a general who combined the tactical brilliance of Alexander with the ruthless pragmatism of his own father, and wrapped it all in a charisma that made men eager to die for him. Standing once again on a ridge overlooking conquered territory, but this time alone, Hamilcar had fallen 3 years earlier, drowned crossing a river swollen with winter rain. Hannibal allowed himself to remember the oath sworn in that temple long ago. The boy who had made that promise was gone, transformed into something harder and more focused, but the promise itself remained, burning in his chest like a coal that would never cool. To the east, beyond the mountains and the sea, Rome grew fat on tribute and complacent in victory. Its citizens went about their daily lives, buying bread, arguing politics, falling in love, raising children, unaware that across the water a storm was gathering that would test every assumption they had ever made about their place in the world. The making of the warrior was complete. Now came the harder part, keeping the promise. Snow. It falls like silence made visible, each flake a small death drifting down from a sky the color of old pewter. But in the memory of those who lived through it, the snow was not the worst part. The worst part was the cold that went deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, settling into men's souls like winter itself had taken up residence there. Picture them now, if you can. 90,000 men stretched across a mountain pass that had no name in any civilized tongue. Carthaginians in bronze that had turned green with cold. Spanish warriors wrapped in wolf pelts that still smelled of the hunt. Numidians from Africa who had never seen snow and now walked through drifts that swallowed them to the waist. And at their head, wrapped in a cloak that had once been purple but now showed the stains of 1,000 impossible miles, rode Hannibal Barca. It was October, and the Alps had begun their yearly transformation from obstacle to impossibility. The passes that mountain shepherds used in summer were now choked with ice and the promise of avalanche. The air itself had grown thin, each breath a visible prayer that rose and dissipated like incense in a temple dedicated to suffering. But they had come too far to turn back now. Behind them lay the burning ruins of Saguntum and a war declaration that had crossed the Mediterranean like lightning across summer sky. Ahead lay Italy, and beyond Italy, Rome itself, sleeping behind its walls, confident that no enemy would ever dare what they were daring now. "Tell me again why we march through hell itself," whispered Hannibal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, as his horse picked its way carefully between rocks that could shatter a hoof and ice that could blind a man. His breath formed clouds that the wind snatched away before they could dissipate, and his usually immaculate beard was now frozen with icicles that tinkled like wind chimes when he spoke. "Because hell is the last place Rome expects to find us," Hannibal replied, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Despite everything, the cold, the altitude, the growing desperation in his men's eyes, his voice remained steady. It was the voice that had convinced these thousands to follow him beyond the edge of the known world, and it would not falter now. They watched their harbors, fortify their coasts, and prepare for an enemy who will come by sea. They do not watch the clouds. The crossing had begun in what the Romans called Gaul, where autumn painted the forests in shades of fire, and the local tribes watched with a mixture of awe and terror as the Carthaginian army passed through their lands like a migration of predators. Some had joined them, drawn by promises of Roman gold and the chance to settle old scores. Others had simply melted away into the forests, preferring to let the mountains do what armies could not. The elephants were the worst to watch. These great beasts from Africa, trained for war but not for the soul-crushing cold of high altitudes, moved through the snow like living monuments to suffering. Their thick hides, which had turned aside spears and arrows, offered no protection against cold that crept in through every breath. One by one they began to falter. Hannibal had brought 37 elephants across the Pyrenees. By the time they reached the highest passes of the Alps, only a handful remained. Each loss was like watching a piece of Carthage itself die in the snow. These magnificent creatures, who had trumpeted their rage across Spanish battlefields, now reduced to frozen corpses that the army left behind, like markers of their passage. But it was not just the elephants who died in those frozen heights. Men fell too, not all at once in the glorious fury of battle, but quietly, one by one, their strength simply bleeding away into the pitiless cold. A Numidian horseman would dismount to help a fallen comrade and never remount. A Spanish warrior would sit down to rest and never stand again. They died with dignity, these men who had followed their general beyond the edge of the world, but they died nonetheless. The local tribes were another constant threat. These mountain people had lived in the shadow of the peaks for countless generations, and they knew every path, every hidden approach, every place where rocks could be sent tumbling down onto unwary invaders. They struck without warning and vanished like mist, leaving behind only bodies in the snow and the growing certainty that the mountains themselves were hostile to their passage. On the worst night, later survivors would simply call it the night. As if no other darkness had ever existed, Hannibal walked alone through the camp, listening to the sounds that armies make when they begin to understand they might not survive. Men prayed in a dozen different languages to gods whose names had never before been spoken in such high and lonely places. Some wept for homes they would never see again. Others simply stared at the stars, which seemed closer here, but no warmer. He found them clustered around fires that gave more hope than heat, sharing the last of their wine, and speaking in the careful, measured tones that men use when they discuss the possibility of their own deaths. Many had frostbite now, blackened fingers and toes that would have to be removed if they lived long enough to reach a place where surgeons plied their trade. Others had developed the 1,000-yard stare that comes to those who have looked too long into an abyss and seen it looking back. "General!" called out a voice from one of the fires. It belonged to a veteran of the Spanish campaigns, a man whose scars told the story of 20 years' faithful service. "The men are asking, do you really believe we can do this?" It was the question that had been hanging in the air like smoke, the question that everyone was thinking but no one had dared to voice. Hannibal stopped walking and turned to face the circle of firelight, his breath forming clouds that caught the orange glow and made him seem for a moment like some spirit of the mountains speaking prophecy. "Come with me," he said simply. He led them up through the snow, past sleeping men and dying fires to a ridge that looked out over the eastern slopes of the mountains. There, spread out below them in the distance, lay something that made grown warriors gasp like children seeing their first sunrise. Italy. It stretched away into the darkness, like a dream made real. Vast plains and rolling hills, rivers that caught starlight and threw it back like scattered silver, and somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the 7 hills where Rome slept behind its walls. After weeks of rock and ice and the constant presence of death, the sight of that promised land brought tears to eyes that had not wept since childhood. "Do you see?" Hannibal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see what waits for us beyond this last barrier?" They saw, and in seeing they remembered why they had come so far and endured so much. This was not just about conquest or revenge or the settling of old scores. This was about proving that the impossible was simply another word for untried, that the greatest barriers existed not in the world, but in the minds of those who accepted limitation as fate. When dawn came, the army moved as one. The worst was behind them now, not because the path had grown easier, but because they had remembered what they were fighting for. Step by step, breath by breath, they began the final descent toward the plains of northern Italy. Behind them, they left the bones of those who had not made it, good men who had died in service to a dream larger than themselves. The mountains would keep these remains safe, locked in ice that would not melt for 1,000 years, preserving their sacrifice until men forgot the names of the generals they had served and the cause for which they had died. But ahead lay something that would make their sacrifice meaningful, the chance to prove that Rome was not invincible, that its eagles could be brought down, that the empire which claimed dominion over the civilized world could be made to tremble. Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, keeper of oaths and breaker of impossibilities, had crossed the Alps. Winter had not stopped him. Death had not stopped him. The very mountains themselves had bent before his will. Now came the easy part, the conquest of Rome. The river Ticinus moved like liquid silver through the autumn landscape, its waters reflecting a sky the color of old bronze. It was here, on the banks of this unremarkable waterway, that Rome first learned to taste fear in its mouth, like copper pennies and broken dreams. The date was November, and the leaves were falling like golden coins scattered by a careless god. Publius Cornelius Scipio had brought his legions north with the confidence that came from generations of victory. In his mind, this would be a simple matter: crush the barbarian who had dared cross the Alps, restore order to the frontier, and return to Rome in time for the winter festivals. He was a good general, competent and brave, but he had one fatal flaw. He believed his own people's stories about Roman invincibility. The morning mist clung to the water like the breath of sleeping spirits. Through it came the sound that would haunt Roman nightmares for years to come, the thunder of cavalry moving at full charge, punctuated by war cries in languages that had never before been heard in the Po Valley. The Numidians rode like centaurs, their horses extensions of their own bodies, while Spanish cavalry followed in perfect formation, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the pale light. But it was not the cavalry that made Roman hearts race with something that might have been excitement, but felt remarkably like terror. It was the man who led them, tall in his saddle, his cloak streaming behind him like the wings of some predatory bird, his eyes already calculating victory, while Roman generals were still trying to understand the nature of the threat they faced. Hannibal had been in Italy for less than a month, but already he was learning its rhythms, its weaknesses, its secret fears. The local Gallic tribes, hungry for revenge against Roman tax collectors and land commissioners, had flocked to his banners like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. His army, battered by the mountain crossing, was growing strong again on Italian grain and Italian hope for liberation. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic. Scipio's legions formed up in their traditional formation, solid, disciplined, implacable as a moving wall. They had conquered half the known world fighting this way, and they saw no reason to change tactics for one barbarian general, no matter how far he had traveled to meet them. They could not have been more wrong. Hannibal's cavalry struck the Roman flanks like lightning splitting an oak tree. While the legions were still adjusting their formation to meet this unexpected threat, Numidian horsemen were already behind them, cutting down supply bearers and support troops with the methodical efficiency of farmers harvesting grain. The Roman cavalry, brave but inexperienced in facing enemies who rode as if they had been born in the saddle, lasted perhaps 10 minutes before breaking. Their horses, bred for parade duty and the occasional frontier skirmish, were no match for the small, hardy mounts that had carried their riders across deserts and mountains. Within moments, what had been an orderly charge became a rout, and what had been a rout became a massacre. Scipio himself, his purple cloak now stained with mud and blood, found himself isolated with a handful of his personal guard. Around him, The careful formations of Rome's finest infantry dissolved into chaos as cavalry struck from 3 directions at once. This was not how wars were supposed to be fought. There should have been formal declarations, ritual challenges, time for the gods to choose sides and make their preferences known. Instead, there was only the terrible efficiency of Hannibal's tactical genius and the growing understanding that everything the Romans thought they knew about warfare had just become obsolete. Young Publius Scipio, later to be known to history as Scipio Africanus, rode that day as a junior officer in his father's army. He was 17 years old, filled with the stories of Roman glory that every citizen learned at his father's knee. The sight of Roman eagles retreating, Roman blood soaking into foreign soil, Roman voices crying out in defeat rather than victory, would mark him in ways that would not become clear for years to come. But on this particular morning, as autumn mist revealed the scope of Roman defeat, he was simply a boy learning that the world was larger and more dangerous than anyone in Rome had imagined. He watched his father's army dissolve like salt in water, watched grown men, veterans of a dozen campaigns, throw down their weapons and run like children fleeing from nightmares. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the tactical defeat. Word of the disaster spread through northern Italy like wildfire, carried by survivors who spoke in whispers of cavalry that moved like thunder, and a general who seemed to know what his enemies would do before they did it themselves. In the marketplaces of Roman settlements, people began to board up their shops and bury their silver. In the temples, priests increased their sacrifices and tried to read meaning in the flight patterns of birds that seemed themselves to be fleeing south. But perhaps the most significant moment came not during the battle itself, but in its aftermath. As Hannibal rode through the field where Roman pride lay scattered like broken pottery, he came upon a sight that would have broken a lesser man's heart. The bodies of his own soldiers, men who had followed him across the Alps and died in the service of his impossible dream. Among them was a boy from Carthage, barely old enough to carry a spear, who had spoken often of his mother's cooking and his father's fishing boat. He lay now with his eyes open to the sky, his lips curved in what might have been a smile if you didn't look too closely. Hannibal knelt beside him, closed those unseeing eyes with his own fingers, and spoke a prayer in the old tongue that his grandmother had taught him. This was the price of glory, not just the enemy dead who littered the field like discarded flowers, but the young men of his own people who would never again feel sunlight on their faces or hear their mothers call their names at evening. Victory, he was learning, tasted like ashes mixed with honey, sweet and bitter in equal measure. But there was no time for extended mourning. Rome would not be caught off guard again. Already, word was racing south along the stone roads that connected every corner of the empire, like veins in a vast body. New legions would be raised, new generals appointed, new strategies devised. The Romans were slow to adapt, but they learned from their mistakes with the patience of people who had built their empire one stone at a time. That night, as his men celebrated their first victory on Italian soil with wine captured from Roman supply trains, Hannibal stood alone on a hill overlooking the battlefield. The dead lay where they had fallen, Roman and Carthaginian alike, their differences finally resolved in the democracy of death. By morning, the crows would come to claim their due, and by spring, wildflowers would grow from soil enriched by the blood of brave men. In the distance, cooking fires twinkled like fallen stars across the Gallic camps. The local tribes were celebrating, convinced that they had chosen the winning side in a conflict that would reshape their world. They brought their sons to be blessed by the general who had humbled Rome, and their daughters sang songs in his honor around fires that would burn until dawn. But Hannibal knew something they did not, that this was only the beginning. One battle did not win a war, especially not against an enemy that could replace its losses from a population that stretched from Britain to the desert sands of Africa. Rome was wounded, not dead, and wounded animals were often the most dangerous of all. Still, as he stood there in the Italian darkness with the taste of victory sweet on his tongue, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The oath sworn in a temple in Carthage was being kept. The promise made to his father's shade was being honored, and somewhere to the south in the city of 7 hills, people were beginning to understand that their world was not as safe as they had believed. The terror of Rome had taken its first taste of Roman blood, and found it much to his liking. Mist rises from still water like the souls of the drowned seeking heaven. Lake Trasimene in the early morning hours held the kind of beauty that poets write about, and soldiers die in, deceptively peaceful, ethereally lovely, utterly treacherous. The date was June, and the spring rains had turned the countryside into a green paradise that would soon run red with Roman blood. Gaius Flaminius was a man caught between political necessity and military reality. The Roman people, stung by defeat at Ticinus and tired of hearing about this barbarian who dared to march through their countryside like he owned it, demanded action. Not the cautious defensive action that military wisdom suggested, but bold, aggressive action that would restore Roman pride and end this humiliation quickly. Politicians, as Hannibal had learned during his years in Spain, were often more dangerous to their own armies than enemy generals. They made decisions based on what sounded impressive in the Senate, rather than what worked on the battlefield. Flaminius was brave, competent, and completely predictable, exactly the kind of enemy Hannibal preferred. The trap had been weeks in the making. Like a spider spinning a web, Hannibal had drawn his enemy forward through a series of carefully calculated provocations. A villa burned here, a granary destroyed there, always just close enough to be insulting, always just far enough away to require pursuit. He had studied Flaminius the way a hunter studies the habits of his prey, learning his patterns, his preferences, his fatal tendency to let anger override judgment. The shores of Lake Trasimene provided the perfect killing ground, a narrow defile between water and hills where an army could be surrounded and destroyed piece by piece. But the beauty of Hannibal's plan lay not in the geography alone, but in the psychology. He had arranged things so that when Flaminius arrived, pursuit would seem not just logical, but inevitable. The Roman army came into view just as the sun was beginning to burn off the morning mist. 25,000 legionaries, in perfect formation, their armor glinting like scales on some great serpent, their standards flying proudly in the morning breeze. They marched with the confidence that came from representing the greatest military power the world had ever known, secure in their belief that Roman discipline and Roman valor would triumph over barbarian cunning. Hidden in the hills above, Hannibal's army waited with the patience of wolves. Gauls who had suffered under Roman taxation, Numidians who remembered defeats avenged, Spanish warriors who had learned to trust their general's genius absolutely. 40,000 men holding their breath, while 25,000 enemies marched into the perfect trap. The mist was crucial to everything. It clung to the water and drifted between the hills like a living thing, thick enough to muffle sound and hide movement, thin enough to let Roman confidence convince them they were safe. Flaminius, riding at the head of his army with the easy assurance of a man who had never been outsmarted by a barbarian, saw exactly what Hannibal wanted him to see. A small Carthaginian force, apparently caught between the lake and the hills, trapped and vulnerable. "Look at them," he called to his officers, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The famous Hannibal, cornered at last like the animal he is. Today we end this charade and remind the world why Rome rules and barbarians serve." The first Roman cohort was already engaged with Hannibal's decoy force when the real battle began. It started as a whisper, the sound of feet moving through grass, of weapons being drawn from sheaths, of men taking deep breaths before leaping into the furnace of combat. Then it became a roar that seemed to come from the hills themselves, as if the very landscape had decided to take sides in this ancient quarrel. They came from every direction at once. Gauls painted blue with woad burst from concealment like demons sprung from the earth itself. Spanish infantry, disciplined and deadly, struck the Roman flanks with the precision of a surgeon's knife. Numidian cavalry, moving like the wind made visible, cut off every possible retreat until the lake itself became the only escape route. But Flaminius, to his credit, did not panic. Even as his world collapsed around him like a house built on sand, he fought with the desperate courage of a man who understood that Roman honor demanded death before surrender. His personal guard formed around him like a shield wall of flesh and bronze, their shields locked together in the tortoise formation that had conquered half the world. It was not enough. In a battle where the enemy came from all directions at once, where the very mist seemed to betray Roman positions while concealing Carthaginian movements, traditional tactics became liabilities rather than assets. The tight formations that had served Rome so well on conventional battlefields became traps that prevented maneuver and made every man a target for enemies he could not see. The slaughter lasted 3 hours, though to those caught in its midst, it seemed both eternal and instantaneous. Men fell in their thousands, their blood turning the shallows of the lake pink, and then red, and finally the deep crimson of spilled wine. Some tried to escape by swimming across the water, only to drown under the weight of their armor. Others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy in languages their enemies did not speak or chose not to understand. Flaminius himself died fighting, his sword still in his hand, and his eyes fixed on the standards that had led him so far from home. Sir Gallic warrior's spear found the gap between his breastplate and his shoulder guard, and the general who had demanded action fell among his men like wheat before the scythe. When the mist finally lifted, revealing the full scope of the disaster, even Hannibal's veterans fell silent. The narrow shore of Lake Trasimene had become a carpet of Roman dead so thick that a man could walk from the water's edge to the hills without touching earth. 15,000 legionaries would never again see the 7 hills of Rome. 10,000 more had been taken prisoner, their proud eagles now trophies in Carthaginian hands. But perhaps the most devastating blow was not to Roman bodies, but to Roman confidence. This was not a defeat that could be explained away by bad luck or poor terrain. This was a demonstration that their most fundamental assumptions about warfare, about their own superiority, about the inevitability of their triumph, were nothing more than comfortable lies they had told themselves, while their enemies learned to think in ways they had never imagined. News of Trasimene reached Rome like a plague, spreading from mouth to mouth faster than the official messengers could carry it. In the Forum, senators who had called for aggressive action suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. In the temples, priests made sacrifice after sacrifice, trying to determine which gods they had offended and how those gods might be appeased. But in the markets and the taverns, in the workshops where ordinary Romans made their living, and the homes where they raised their children, a different conversation was taking place. For the first time in generations, people were asking not when Rome would win, but if Rome could lose. Hannibal stood that evening on the battlefield where Roman power had been broken like pottery thrown against stone. Around him, his soldiers moved among the dead with the systematic efficiency of men who had done this before and knew they would do it again. Weapons were collected, armor sorted, anything of value saved for the long campaign that still lay ahead. The prisoners were another matter entirely. 10,000 Romans, many of them young men from good families who had marched north expecting easy glory and found instead a lesson in the harsh mathematics of war. They huddled together in groups, their hands bound with rope taken from their own supply wagons, their eyes holding the particular emptiness that comes to those who have seen their world end. But Hannibal had not crossed the Alps to collect slaves. In a gesture that would be remembered long after the tactical details of the battle were forgotten, he ordered the Roman prisoners released, not from mercy, but from calculation. Let them return to their homes, he reasoned. Let them tell their stories in Roman marketplaces and Roman taverns. Let them plant the seeds of doubt in Roman hearts. "Tell your people," he said to the departing prisoners, his words carrying clearly in the still evening air, "that Hannibal Barca keeps faith with those who keep faith with him. Tell them that this war need not be between our peoples, but between Rome and those who refuse to bow to Roman will." It was masterful propaganda designed to exploit the one weakness that even Rome could not armor against: the growing suspicion among its Italian allies that they might have chosen the wrong side in this ancient quarrel. Already, delegations from Gallic tribes were arriving at the Carthaginian camp, bringing offers of alliance and aid. The victory at Trasimene had done more than destroy a Roman army. It had shattered the myth of Roman invincibility that held their alliance system together. But that night, as Hannibal walked alone among the dead who had followed him so far from home, he felt the weight of the oath he had sworn settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Each victory brought him closer to his goal, but also deeper into a maze from which there might be no escape. Rome was wounded, but not dead, and he was learning that wounded empires, like wounded animals, became more dangerous, not less. In the distance, wolves howled at a moon that looked down on a landscape forever changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new tests of will and endurance. But tonight belonged to the dead, Roman and Carthaginian alike, who had paid the final price for the ambitions of living men. The perfect trap had been sprung. The terror of Rome had fed again. And somewhere to the south, in the city of 7 hills, people were beginning to understand that the world was a more dangerous place than they had ever imagined. After Trasimene, silence fell across the Italian countryside like snow in winter. Not the peaceful quiet of sleeping fields, but the ominous hush that comes when an entire people hold their breath and wait for the next blow to fall. Summer had arrived in all its golden glory, but the usual sounds of harvest and celebration were muted now, replaced by the whispered conversations of farmers who wondered if their crops would feed Roman mouths or Carthaginian ones. Rome had appointed a dictator. Quintus Fabius Maximus was his name, though history would remember him by another title, Cunctator, the Delayer. He was an old man who had seen enough battles to know that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in fighting, but in refusing to fight when your enemy wanted you to. The Roman people called him a coward. Hannibal called him the most dangerous opponent he had yet faced. For months now, the two armies had danced across the Italian peninsula like wrestlers circling each other, each waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. Fabius had learned the lesson of Trasimene well. He would not give Hannibal the quick, decisive battle the Carthaginian needed to end this war before Roman resources and Roman patience could be brought to bear. Instead, he shadowed the invading army like a persistent ghost, striking at foraging parties and supply trains, cutting off stragglers, making every mile Hannibal marched a costly proposition. It was unglamorous work, the kind of warfare that historians rarely celebrated, but it was slowly bleeding the Carthaginian army white. Hannibal understood the strategy perfectly, which made it all the more frustrating to counter. He could win every battle, destroy every Roman force sent against him, and still lose the war if he could not force Rome to the negotiating table. Time was his enemy now, more dangerous than any legion, more deadly than any general. With each passing season, his army grew smaller while Rome's grew larger, fed by the seemingly inexhaustible population of the peninsula. The Carthaginian camp that summer was pitched in the hills overlooking the Volturnus River, a site chosen as much for its beauty as its strategic value. From his tent, Hannibal could see across rolling countryside that reminded him of the Spain he had conquered in his youth. Olive groves and vineyards, small farms and prosperous towns, all the peaceful abundance that war inevitably destroyed. But it was not the landscape that held his attention on this particular evening, as the sun set like molten gold behind distant mountains. It was the reports that arrived with each day's couriers, reports that spoke of changing weather in the larger storm of which his invasion was only one part. His brother Hasdrubal was fighting in Spain, trying to hold the Carthaginian possessions there against a young Roman general who had taken the name Scipio and seemed to fight with something approaching Hannibal's own tactical genius. If Spain fell, the silver mines that funded this entire enterprise would be lost, and the war would become a race between Carthaginian exhaustion and Roman collapse. Meanwhile, in Africa itself, the situation grew more precarious by the month. Rome had not been idle while Hannibal marched through Italy. Their own agents had been at work among the Numidian tribes, spreading gold and promises with the same liberal hand that Hannibal used to win Gallic allies. The loyalty of Carthage's traditional allies could no longer be taken for granted. "General," came a voice from the entrance to his tent. It belonged to Hannibal, his cavalry commander, a man whose scarred face and missing eye spoke of 30 years' faithful service. "The scouts report movement in the Roman camp. Fabius is pulling back again." Hannibal nodded, but did not turn from his contemplation of the darkening horizon. "He yields us the ground, but denies us the victory. A masterful strategy, if he can convince his own people to accept it. The men are growing restless," Hannibal continued, settling himself on a camp stool with the grunt of a man whose joints had absorbed too many campaigns. "They came to fight Romans, not to chase shadows through the countryside. Some of the Gauls are talking of returning to their tribes for the winter." It was the conversation Hannibal had been dreading but expecting. An army was like a sword. Too long unused, it began to rust and lose its edge. His men had followed him across the Alps in the expectation of quick victories and rich plunder. Instead, they found themselves participants in a campaign that seemed to offer neither glory nor gain, only the slow attrition of an enemy who refused to fight on terms they understood. "And what do you counsel?" Hannibal asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Force battle," Hannibal replied without hesitation. "March on Rome itself if necessary. Make them fight us on our terms, not theirs. Better to risk everything on one throw of the dice than to watch our strength bleed away drop by drop." It was the advice that every instinct screamed at Hannibal to take. He had not become the terror of Rome by accepting stalemate. Every fiber of his being, every lesson learned in Spanish wars and Alpine crossings, urged him to strike quickly and decisively before the moment was lost forever. But another voice whispered in his mind, the voice of his father, speaking from memory about the patience required to build lasting victory. "A general who fights only the battles he wants to fight," Hamilcar had said, "will find that his enemies become very cooperative in giving him exactly what he deserves." The truth was that Hannibal's army, for all its skill and experience, was not large enough to besiege Rome itself. The city's walls were strong, its population enormous, its capacity to endure siege legendary. An assault on the capital would be a magnificent gesture, but gesture was all it would be, and dead heroes, however magnificent, won no wars. "We continue as we are," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had brought them all so far from home. Fabius may have found the key to defeating us tactically, but strategy is another matter. Every day we remain undefeated in Italy. Every town that opens its gates to us rather than to Roman tax collectors, every ally that remembers the taste of independence, these are victories that do not shine like bronze but last like stone. Hannibal's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced, but discipline was the foundation on which their entire enterprise rested. If the general commanded patience, then patience they would have, even if it tasted like ashes in the mouth. That night, as the camp settled into the watchful quiet that armies learned in hostile territory, Hannibal walked among his men as was his custom. He listened to their conversations, their complaints, their dreams of home, filing away each fragment of information for later consideration. An army's morale was like a man's health. It required constant attention, and small problems ignored had a way of becoming large disasters. By the light of carefully shielded fires, he saw faces that had grown leaner since crossing the Alps, eyes that had seen too much of war's reality and not enough of its rewards. These were good men, veterans who had followed him beyond the edge of the known world because they believed in his vision of what victory could accomplish. They deserved better than endless maneuver and the gradual erosion of hope, but they also deserved to survive, and survival required adapting to circumstances that no amount of courage could change. Rome had finally found a general who understood that defeating Hannibal did not require defeating him in battle. It only required preventing him from winning decisively before winter and hunger and the simple mathematics of attrition accomplished what bronze and steel could not. The shadow that Hannibal cast across Italy was growing longer, but it was also growing thinner. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, Fabius Maximus was probably having a very similar conversation with his own officers, explaining why the greatest service they could render Rome was to refuse the glorious battle that everyone expected and no one wanted to fight. It was going to be a long war. August heat shimmers like water over stone, and the river Aufidus moves sluggishly through countryside that seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The year is 216, and 2 years have passed since Hannibal first set foot in Italy. 2 years of shadow dancing with Fabius, of victories that led nowhere and maneuvers that accomplished nothing except the slow bleeding of hope from Carthaginian hearts. But Rome had grown tired of patience. The people demanded action, and in a democracy, even one as imperfect as Rome's, the people's voice eventually drowned out the wisdom of their elders. They had elected new consuls, men who promised to end this humiliation quickly and decisively. Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro brought with them the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 86,000 men drawn from every corner of the empire, enough soldiers to crush any enemy through sheer weight of numbers. They came seeking the battle that Fabius had so studiously avoided, and Hannibal, who had spent 2 frustrating years trying to force exactly such a confrontation, was more than happy to oblige them. The plain of Cannae stretched before both armies like an amphitheater built for gods to watch mortals destroy each other in spectacular fashion. It was perfect ground for the kind of set-piece battle that Roman doctrine preferred. Open terrain where superior numbers could be brought to bear, no forests or hills to provide hiding places for clever tactics or unexpected maneuvers. Hannibal chose his position with the care of an artist arranging colors on a palette. The morning sun would be at his back, shining directly into Roman eyes. The wind, such as it was in the still August air, would carry dust from his movements toward the enemy lines. Every small advantage was calculated, weighed, incorporated into a plan that existed complete in his mind before the first Roman standard appeared on the horizon. His army was smaller, barely 50,000 men, many of them Gauls, whose loyalty remained questionable, and Spanish troops whose equipment had seen better days. But they were veterans now, hardened by 2 years of constant campaigning. unified by shared hardship and absolute faith in the genius of their commander. More importantly, they understood that this was their moment. Win here, and Italy might yet be theirs. Lose, and the dream died with them on foreign soil. The Roman formation was exactly what Hannibal had expected. A massive rectangle of infantry, solid as a moving wall, with cavalry on the wings and light troops scattered in front to disrupt enemy charges. It was the formation that had conquered the world, and there was no particular reason to believe it would not conquer once more, except that Hannibal had spent the last decade studying exactly how such formations could be destroyed. He arranged his own troops in a formation that must have seemed bizarre to Roman observers, a convex line that bulged toward the enemy like a bow drawn, but not yet released. The center, where he placed his weakest troops, actually protruded beyond the wings, as if he were offering his most vulnerable point to Roman attack. It was either the work of a madman or a genius, and the distinction would not become clear until the blood began to flow. The battle began as all such encounters did, with the ritual exchange of missile fire, the preliminary skirmishing of light troops, the careful positioning of units like pieces on a vast game board. But there was something different in the air this morning, something that made even veteran soldiers check their equipment one more time and offer one more prayer to whatever gods they thought might be listening. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that this would be decisive. 2 years of maneuvering had led to this moment, this place, this test of everything both sides believed about war and will and the favor of the divine. One way or another, the sun would set on a world fundamentally changed. When the legions finally advanced, they came with the slow, irresistible momentum of a landslide. 80,000 men moving in perfect synchronization, their shields locked together, their spears a forest of bronze-tipped death. The sound was indescribable, not quite thunder, not quite music, but something that seemed to make the very earth tremble in sympathy. They struck Hannibal's center like a hammer striking an anvil, and for a moment it seemed as though the Carthaginian line might simply disintegrate under the impact. The Gallic and Spanish troops stationed there gave ground, step by step, their formation bending backward like a bow under tremendous pressure. But they did not break. This was the crucial element of Hannibal's plan. His center had to retreat, but it had to retreat in good order, drawing the eager Romans deeper and deeper into the trap that was slowly closing around them. Too fast a withdrawal and the line would collapse. Too slow and the Romans would realize what was happening before it was too late to escape. From his position on a small rise overlooking the battlefield, Hannibal watched his masterpiece unfold with the calm satisfaction of an artist whose vision was finally being realized. The Roman center was pushing forward exactly as he had predicted, their commanders urging them on with promises of quick victory. But in their eagerness to exploit what appeared to be Carthaginian weakness, they were compressing their own formation, packing more and more men into a smaller and smaller space. Meanwhile, on the wings, his African infantry, his best troops held in reserve for this moment, began their own advance. These were veterans of the Spanish Wars, men who had learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable. They moved with the precision of clockwork, wheeling inward to strike the Roman flanks just as the cavalry completed its own encircling movement. The moment when the Romans realized their danger was visible from across the field, a ripple of understanding that passed through their ranks like wind through wheat. Commands were shouted, horns sounded, desperate attempts made to reform lines that had become hopelessly compressed. But it was too late. What had begun as a Roman advance had become a Roman encirclement. Hannibal's retreating center suddenly stiffened and held, while his wings closed like the jaws of some enormous trap. The hunters had become the hunted, and 86,000 Romans found themselves surrounded by 50,000 enemies, who had turned the very size of their army against them. The slaughter that followed was methodical, almost scientific in its efficiency. Packed too tightly to use their weapons effectively, unable to retreat or advance, the legions died where they stood. For 6 hours the killing continued under a merciless sun that turned the plain into a furnace and the river into a ribbon of blood. Consul Paulus died fighting in the center, his body pierced by so many spears that he looked like a porcupine when they finally found him. Varro escaped with a handful of cavalry, riding hard for the walls of Rome with news that would shake the Republic to its foundations. Behind him, he left 70,000 Roman dead, and the broken remnants of an army that had marched out that morning believing itself invincible. But perhaps the most devastating casualty was not any individual life, but something more intangible, the myth of Roman military supremacy that had been built over centuries of conquest. In a single afternoon, on a plain in southern Italy, that myth died as completely as the men who had embodied it. As evening fell and the last Roman resistance collapsed, Hannibal walked across a battlefield that defied description. Bodies lay piled so deep that in places a man could not see the ground beneath them. The air was thick with flies and the cries of the wounded, while vultures circled overhead in numbers that blocked out the stars. His officers came to him with reports of the day's success: enemy standards captured, treasure seized, prisoners taken. But he waved them away with the weariness of a man who had just witnessed the logical conclusion of everything he had worked toward for the last decade. "Sir," called Hannibal, his voice tight with excitement, "give me the cavalry, and I will dine in Rome 5 days hence. You have won the war, now win the victory." Hannibal looked at his old friend and companion, this man who had followed him across the Alps and shared every hardship of the long campaign. How to explain that winning battles and winning wars were different things entirely? That destroying armies was easier than destroying the will that raised them? "Not today, my friend," he said quietly. "Today we have proven that Rome can be defeated. Tomorrow we must prove that she can be convinced to accept defeat." In the distance, refugees from the battlefield were already streaming south, carrying word of the disaster to every town and village between Cannae and the capital. By the time they reached Rome, the story would have grown in the telling, the defeat magnified into apocalypse. But Rome would not surrender. Hannibal knew this, had always known it, even as he planned the very battle that should have forced exactly that result. The Romans were many things, arrogant, brutal, inflexible, but they were not quitters. They would raise new armies, appoint new generals, adapt their tactics to counter his advantages. And he would continue to win battles he could not afford to fight. In a war he was beginning to suspect he could not win. The eagles had fallen at Cannae, but somehow that only made the remaining ones more dangerous. Winter comes to Italy like a thief in the night, stealing the warmth from stone and bone alike, painting the countryside in shades of grey that matched the mood of armies too exhausted to fight and too committed to surrender. 3 years had passed since Cannae, 3 years of victories that led nowhere and defeats that could not be afforded, 3 years of a war that had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the changing seasons. Hannibal's army had found winter quarters in the hills of Campania, in a countryside that had once been rich, but now bore the scars of armies passing through like locusts. The local population had learned to hide their grain in caves and bury their silver in places that appeared on no maps, for soldiers, whether Roman or Carthaginian, had appetites that peace could not satisfy. The general himself had aged in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time. There were new lines around his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting across too many battlefields at enemies who refused to stay defeated. His hair, once black as a raven's wing, now showed streaks of silver that caught the firelight when he bent over maps that seemed to offer fewer options with each passing year. Reports arrived with the winter winds. carried by messengers who rode through countryside that belonged to no one and everyone. From Spain came word that Hasdrubal was fighting a desperate holding action against Roman forces that seemed to multiply like mushrooms after rain. The silver mines that had funded this entire enterprise were slipping from Carthaginian control, captured one by a young Roman general who fought with tactics that seemed suspiciously familiar. "He studies us," Hannibal murmured to himself as he read the latest dispatch. "This Scipio learns from our victories and adapts our methods to Roman purposes. Dangerous." From Africa came news that was, if possible, even worse. The Numidian prince Massinissa, once a reliable ally, had begun making overtures to Rome. His light cavalry, the horsemen who had won so many battles for Carthage, might soon be riding under different banners entirely. The war was becoming a race between Carthaginian exhaustion and Roman adaptation, and Hannibal was no longer certain which would triumph. But it was the news from Rome itself that troubled him most. The city had not collapsed after Cannae, as logic suggested it should have. Instead, it had done something characteristically Roman. It had simply refused to acknowledge that defeat was possible. New legions had been raised from slaves and allies, new taxes imposed to fund the war effort, new strategies developed to counter Carthaginian advantages. They had even found generals who understood that defeating Hannibal did not require defeating him in open battle. Marcus Claudius Marcellus had earned the nickname the Sword of Rome by winning a series of small victories that slowly chipped away at Carthaginian strength. Meanwhile, Fabius Maximus, still derided as the delayer by those who preferred the drama of pitched battle to the mathematics of attrition, continued to shadow the Carthaginian army like a persistent ghost. Most troubling of all was the systematic way Rome was reclaiming its Italian allies. Cities that had opened their gates to Hannibal after Cannae were now returning to Roman allegiance, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes after brief sieges that demonstrated the futility of resistance. The great coalition of the oppressed that was supposed to rise against Roman tyranny had proven to be largely imaginary. "They fear us," observed Maharbal one evening as they sat around a fire that gave more smoke than heat, sharing wine that had been watered to make it last longer. "But they fear Rome more. They know that if we lose, they will pay the price for their betrayal. Better to suffer Roman taxation than Roman vengeance." It was a truth that Hannibal had been reluctant to acknowledge, but could no longer ignore. The Italians had not been waiting for liberation. They had been waiting to see which side would win before committing themselves irrevocably. Now, with each passing season making Carthaginian victory seem less likely, they were quietly returning to the fold. His own army was changing as well. The veterans who had crossed the Alps with him were fewer now, their ranks thinned by disease and battle and the simple mathematics of a campaign that had lasted longer than anyone had anticipated. Their replacements were drawn from the local population, Gauls and Samnites and Lucanians, who fought well enough but lacked the fierce loyalty that had held the original force together through impossible hardships. More concerning was the growing divide between those who wanted to continue the campaign and those who whispered of negotiated peace. The Carthaginian government, faced with mounting expenses and dwindling returns, had begun sending fewer supplies and more pointed questions about when this investment might begin paying dividends. Politicians, Hannibal reflected bitterly, had short memories for the risks they had once been eager to take. But the most difficult challenge was not external pressure or political maneuvering. It was the simple fact that Hannibal himself was no longer certain what victory would look like. He had dreamed of bringing Rome to its knees, of forcing the proud republic to acknowledge Carthaginian superiority and accept terms that would guarantee his homeland's security for generations to come. Instead, he found himself fighting a war that had no clear end point. Each victory led only to the need for another victory. Each success raised the stakes for the next battle. Each day spent in Italy was a day closer to the moment when his enemy's patience would outlast his own resources. There were still moments of triumph, flashes of the old genius that had carried him across the Alps and onto the pages of history. The siege of Tarentum had been masterfully conducted, a combination of military pressure and political subversion that delivered one of southern Italy's most important ports into Carthaginian hands. The Battle of Herdonia had seen Roman forces scattered like leaves before autumn wind, their generals' heads sent to Rome in a basket lined with silk. But these were tactical victories in a strategic stalemate, brief illuminations in a conflict that was slowly grinding both sides down to exhaustion. The war had become a test not of genius or courage, but of simple endurance. And in that contest, Rome's advantages in population and resources were beginning to tell. Late at night, when the camp had settled into the watchful quiet that armies learned in hostile territory, Hannibal would sometimes climb to the highest hill in their position and look south toward the city that remained tantalizingly beyond his reach. Somewhere in that direction, beyond ranges of hills and rivers swollen with winter rain, Rome slept behind its walls, wounded but not broken, humbled but not humiliated, learning painful lessons about the cost of empire, but not yet ready to abandon the dream that had driven its expansion across the known world. He had kept his oath, the promise made to his father in a temple that now seemed as distant as the stars. Rome had learned to fear the name of Hannibal Barca, had felt the lightning strike again and again until its people huddled in their homes and wondered if their gods had abandoned them. But fear, he was discovering, was not the same thing as surrender. The stalemate stretched ahead like winter itself, cold, grey, and seemingly endless. And somewhere in the darkness, both armies settled down to wait for spring and the resumption of a war that neither side knew how to end. The eternal city spreads before him like a fever dream, its 7 hills crowned with temples that seem to touch the clouds themselves. After 16 years in Italy, 16 years of marching through olive groves and mountain passes, of victory and frustration in equal measure, Hannibal Barca finally stands within sight of the prize that has driven him across the known world. But Rome in 211 is not the city he had imagined in his youth, when victory seemed as inevitable as sunrise, and the oath sworn in a Carthaginian temple burned in his chest like a sacred flame. This Rome bears the scars of a war that has touched every family, impoverished every household, tested every assumption about the natural order of things. Yet it endures, massive and implacable as the hills on which it was built. The approach had been masterful, a final demonstration of the tactical genius that had made his name synonymous with terror across 3 continents. While Roman armies chased shadows in southern Italy, convinced that the aging lion had finally lost his claws, Hannibal had made one last throw of the dice, a lightning march north that brought his army to the gates of the city itself in just 4 days. The psychological impact was everything he had hoped for, and more. Panic spread through the streets like wildfire as word arrived that the Carthaginian army was less than a day's march from the city walls. Citizens who had grown complacent after years of distant warfare suddenly remembered what it meant to live in a world where enemies could appear without warning, where safety was an illusion that could be shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats on stone roads. But standing here now, studying the massive fortifications that encircled the city like a stone embrace, Hannibal understood with crystalline clarity why he had spent 16 years avoiding this moment. Rome was not Saguntum or Tarentum, cities that could be taken by storm or treachery. This was a fortress that had been building its defenses for 7 centuries a citadel that could house 1,000,000 souls and withstand siege for years if necessary. His army, reduced by disease and attrition to perhaps 25,000 effective soldiers, was barely sufficient to invest a single section of the walls, much less conduct a proper siege. The mathematics were brutally simple. Even if every one of his men were willing to die in the assault, they could not break defenses held by a population that outnumbered them 40 to 1. "It's magnificent," whispered Hannibal, his voice carrying the awe that even enemies must feel when confronted with human achievement on such a scale. The old cavalry commander had lost an arm at the siege of Nola, but refused retirement, claiming that he had come too far to miss the final act of this drama, like something the gods built, then handed over to mortals as a jest. From their position on the Alban hills, they could see the city entire. The Campus Martius, where Roman armies had trained for generations, the Forum, where senators debated the fate of nations, the Palatine Hill, where legends claimed the city's founders had first set foot. Smoke rose from thousands of cooking fires, while the Tiber wound through it all like a silver thread, connecting past to present to future. The sight should have filled him with rage or triumph, or at least the satisfaction of a promise finally kept. Instead, Hannibal felt only a peculiar emptiness, as if he had climbed a mountain for 16 years, only to discover that the view from the summit was not what he had expected. Below them, Roman defenders moved along the walls with the disciplined urgency of ants preparing for winter. Ballistae were wheeled into position on the towers, their bronze-wrapped arms gleaming in the afternoon sun. Supply wagons creaked through the gates, carrying grain and oil, while messengers galloped in every direction with dispatches that would summon help from every corner of the empire. But it was not the military preparations that captured Hannibal's attention. It was the ordinary citizens going about their daily business, as if an enemy army were not camped within sight of their homes. Children played in the streets, merchants hawked their wares in the markets, old men gathered in the shade of temples to argue about politics and philosophy and the proper way to conduct sacrifices to gods who seemed increasingly indifferent to human concerns. This was what he had been fighting all these years, not armies or generals or even the abstract concept of Roman power, but this vast, chaotic, infinitely resilient human organism that called itself a republic and somehow made the impossible seem routine. It was a city that had absorbed defeat after defeat, lost army after army, seen its countryside ravaged and its allies desert, and yet continued to function as if the natural order of things guaranteed its ultimate survival. "We cannot take it," he said finally, the words emerging with the flat certainty of mathematical proof. "Not with this army, not in this season, not against defenders who have had 16 years to prepare for our arrival." Hannibal's scarred face showed no surprise. The old soldier had reached the same conclusion within minutes of seeing the walls. Then why did we come? It was a fair question, and one that Hannibal had been asking himself since the march began. Perhaps it was simply the need to complete the circle, to stand where his oath had always pointed him, and measure the distance between dream and reality. Perhaps it was the hope that the mere sight of Carthaginian standards before Roman gates would finally break the Republic's will to continue this ruinous conflict. Or perhaps it was just the acknowledgement that his war was ending, not with the dramatic siege and conquest that poets would sing about, but with the quiet recognition that some prizes were simply too large for any one man to claim. The night that followed was one of the strangest in Roman history. A Carthaginian army camped so close to the city that sentries on both sides could hear each other's challenges, yet no assault came. Instead, there was an almost festival atmosphere as citizens climbed to rooftops and towers to catch glimpses of the legendary enemy who had haunted their nightmares for so long. Some enterprising Roman had even organized guided tours of the walls, charging admission for the privilege of seeing Hannibal's camp through a telescope borrowed from an astronomer. Street vendors sold meat pies and watered wine to the crowds, while children played games in which they took turns being either Romans or Carthaginians, their mock battles dissolving into laughter when someone's mother called them home for dinner. For Hannibal, watching this strange carnival from his pavilion on the hills, it was perhaps the most profound defeat he had ever suffered. He had spent 16 years teaching Rome to fear him, and in the end, they had transformed even that fear into something characteristically Roman, a source of entertainment, a curiosity to be observed and discussed, and ultimately absorbed into the endless conversation that was Roman civilization. On the third day, as if to demonstrate their contempt for his presence, the Romans held an auction in the Forum. The property being sold was the very ground on which his army was camped, a gesture so audaciously insulting that Hannibal found himself laughing despite everything. Only Rome would think to profit from an enemy's proximity, to turn invasion itself into a business opportunity. The price, he learned from spies in the city, had been higher than expected. But perhaps the most telling moment came when a delegation of Roman priests approached his camp under a flag of truce. They had come, they explained, with the elaborate courtesy that Romans brought to even the most desperate situations, to perform certain sacrifices that had been delayed by the inconvenience of having an enemy army blocking access to a particular sacred grove. They wished to know if the general would be so kind as to permit them to complete their religious obligations. In return, they offered to include prayers for his own health and safe journey in their ceremonies. It was a masterpiece of Roman psychology, treating his presence not as a mortal threat, but as a minor inconvenience, like rain during a festival or a traffic jam in the narrow streets. By reducing him to the level of a bureaucratic problem to be solved through proper procedures and polite negotiation, they stripped his invasion of its terror and transformed it into just another item on the endless list of things that Romans had to deal with in their daily lives. He granted the request, of course. What else could he do? Refusing would have made him seem petty, while accepting demonstrated that even he acknowledged Rome's right to conduct its affairs according to its own customs. Either way, the psychological victory belonged to his enemies. That night, as August heat gave way to the first whisper of autumn, Hannibal made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Standing in his tent with maps spread before him, like the scattered fragments of a shattered dream, he traced with one finger the route that had brought him so far from home, across the Alps, down the spine of Italy, through 16 years of victories that had somehow added up to defeat. The math was inexorable. His brother Hasdrubal was dead, killed trying to bring reinforcements from Spain. The silver mines that had funded this entire enterprise were now in Roman hands. Carthage itself was under siege, the city's survival dependent on an army that was trapped in Italy, with no clear path to victory or honorable withdrawal. "We go south," he told his assembled officers, his voice carrying the authority that had brought them all so far from everything they had once called home. "Back to the heel of Italy, where we can hold defensive positions until circumstances change. Until rescue came from Africa," he did not say. Until Carthage found the resources to support its most distant army. Until Rome finally grew tired of a war that had consumed a generation and impoverished an empire. Until some miracle restored the balance that had shifted so decisively against them. But they all understood what he was really saying. The war was over, even if the fighting would continue. The lightning that bore his name had finally exhausted itself against walls too strong to shatter and a people too stubborn to break. All that remained was the long, bitter process of discovering how much pride could be salvaged from the wreckage of impossible dreams. As dawn broke over the 7 hills, revealing a city that would endure long after the last Carthaginian soldier had departed its vicinity, The greatest army in the ancient world began its final retreat. They marched in good order, their standards flying proudly, their discipline intact despite everything. But they marched away from Rome, and everyone watching, Roman and Carthaginian alike, understood that they would never return. The walls of Rome had held. The Republic would survive. And somewhere in the growing distance, a dream born in a temple in Carthage finally died. Its death marked not by dramatic collapse, but by the simple recognition that some fortresses were too strong, some peoples too resilient, some oaths too costly to keep. The terror of Rome had looked upon the eternal city, and found it eternal indeed. The ships appeared on the horizon like dark birds against the morning sky, their sails full of wind that carried them across waters that had once belonged to Carthage, but now served Roman purposes. From his position on the hills overlooking Bruttium, the toe of Italy's boot, where his army had spent 2 years in increasingly desperate circumstances, Hannibal watched the fleet approach with the fatalistic calm of a man who had finally run out of miracles. The year was 203, and the world had changed in ways that made his 16-year campaign seem like a chapter from someone else's story. Rome had not merely survived his invasion. It had learned from it, adapted to it, and ultimately turned his own methods against their creators. Somewhere across the Mediterranean, in the land of his birth, another Roman army was demonstrating what Carthaginian tactics looked like when wielded by Roman discipline. The messenger who brought the news was barely old enough to grow a proper beard, his face bearing the peculiar mixture of exhaustion and terror that came to men who had ridden too far with tidings too terrible to bear. He threw himself from his lathered horse and approached with the careful deference that soldiers learned when they served generals whose reputations had been built on the bones of dead enemies. "Sir," he gasped, his voice cracking from thirst and the weight of words he wished he did not have to speak. "From Carthage, the Senate, they command your immediate return." The scroll he offered bore the seals that Hannibal had learned to read before he could properly write his own name, the symbols of a government that had once been the most powerful commercial empire in the world. Now those seals adorned a desperate plea from a city under siege, a last roll of the dice from leaders who had finally understood that their greatest general was their only hope of survival. Hannibal read the dispatch in silence, his face showing nothing of what the words meant to him. Scipio Africanus, the young Roman who had earned his name by conquering Carthaginian Spain, had landed in Africa with an army trained in all the lessons that 16 years of war had taught. The tables had turned with the inexorable logic of a wheel coming full circle, and now it was Rome that carried the war to its enemy's heartland. "How many ships does he command?" Hannibal asked, gesturing toward the Roman fleet that was now close enough to make out individual vessels. 40 quinqueremes, sir, with perhaps 10,000 marines, enough to evacuate the army, if that is your decision. If that is your decision." The words hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that went far beyond military logistics. This was the moment that every general dreaded and most never lived to see, the recognition that the war they had fought was ending not with victory or glorious defeat, but with the simple acknowledgement that continuing would serve no purpose except to pile futility upon futility. Around him, his officers waited with the patience that came from following a man whose decisions had kept them alive through impossible circumstances. These were the last of the originals, men who had crossed the Alps when the world was young and victory seemed as inevitable as sunrise. Hannibal with his scarred face and missing arm, Mago whose tactical genius had saved them at a dozen battles, Hanno whose engineering skills had turned every camp into a fortress. They were old now, grey-haired and weathered by campaigns that had stretched across decades. Their armor bore the dents and scratches of countless engagements, while their eyes held the peculiar depth that came to men who had seen too much of war's reality. But they were still his, still willing to follow wherever he chose to lead, even if that destination was the end of everything they had worked to achieve. "Gentlemen," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we are going home." The evacuation took 3 days, time enough for every man to understand what they were leaving behind. For most of Hannibal's soldiers, Italy had become more home than their birthplaces. They had spent the best years of their lives marching through its valleys and sleeping under its stars, learning its languages and customs, taking wives from its villages, and fathering children who spoke Latin as their first tongue. Now they were leaving all of that behind, sailing away from the land they had conquered but never quite possessed, carrying with them only their weapons and their memories of what might have been. Many would never see these shores again. Others would return as prisoners or slaves, their fate determined by the same Roman mercy that had once seemed like such a distant concern. But perhaps the hardest goodbye was not to the land or its people, but to the dream that had sustained them through 16 years of impossible hardship. They had come to Italy believing that Rome could be humbled, that the Republic's apparent invincibility was merely a mask covering fundamental weaknesses that Carthaginian genius could exploit. Instead, they had discovered that Rome's greatest strength was not its legions or its walls, but its capacity to absorb punishment that would have broken any other power. The Republic had lost more men at Cannae than Carthage had in its entire army, yet somehow found the resources to raise new legions and continue the fight. It had seen its countryside ravaged and its allies desert, yet somehow maintained the will to carry the war to its enemy's heartland when opportunity arose. This was the lesson that Hannibal carried away from Italy, that some enemies were too large to be defeated by any single blow, no matter how perfectly delivered. Victory required not just tactical brilliance or strategic vision, but the kind of sustained effort that only vast populations and endless resources could maintain. In that contest, genius was no match for simple arithmetic. The ships that carried them away from Italian shores bore more than just soldiers and equipment. They carried the accumulated wisdom of a war that had changed the nature of warfare itself. Future generals would study Hannibal's campaigns not just for their tactical innovations, but for their demonstration of what was possible when intelligence and audacity were combined with absolute commitment to an impossible goal. But they would also learn the war's other lesson, that brilliance, however dazzling, was ultimately subject to the same mathematical laws that governed all human endeavors. Numbers mattered, resources mattered, the capacity to endure and adapt and continue fighting when defeat seemed certain. These things mattered more than all the clever maneuvers and tactical surprises that military history celebrated. As the Italian coast faded into the blue distance behind them, Hannibal stood at the stern of the flagship and allowed himself one last look at the land that had consumed half his life. Somewhere in those hills and valleys lay the bones of men who had followed him beyond the edge of the known world, good soldiers who had died in service to a dream that was larger than any one life. Their sacrifice had not been meaningless. Rome would never again take its invincibility for granted, never again assume that the Mediterranean was a Roman lake or that the empire's borders were inviolate. The fear that Hannibal had planted in Roman hearts would outlive the man who planted it, becoming part of the collective memory that shaped how future generations thought about security and strength and the price of empire. But it had not been enough. The oath sworn in a temple in Carthage would remain forever unfulfilled, a promise that had proven too large for any mortal to keep. Rome endured, wounded but unbroken, while the lightning that bore his name finally exhausted itself against defenses too deep and too strong for any storm to overcome. The tide had turned at last. Now came the final test, to discover whether the man who had terrorized an empire could find the courage to face his own defeat with the same dignity he had brought to victory. Behind them, Italy basked in autumn sunshine, its wounds already beginning to heal. Ahead lay Africa and destiny, and the last act of a drama that had captivated the ancient world for nearly 2 decades. The terror of Rome was going home. The African sun burns with a different intensity than the mild light of Italian summers, harsh and unforgiving as the truth that waits at the end of all long journeys. Zama, a name that would echo through history like the toll of funeral bells, stretches before them under a sky the color of hammered bronze, its empty plain offering no shelter from either the heat or the destiny that advances toward them with the inexorable patience of Roman legions. Hannibal dismounts from his horse and walks the ground where everything will be decided, his feet finding the rhythm that has carried him across 3 continents and through 2 decades of war. The earth here is hard-packed clay mixed with sand, good for cavalry if the wind is right, treacherous if the gods decide to make sport of mortal ambitions. He has studied terrain like this since childhood, learning to read the subtle signs that spell victory or defeat for those who know how to look. But this is different. For the first time in his life, he faces an enemy who has studied him as intensely as he has studied the art of war itself. Publius Cornelius Scipio, Africanus they call him now, though he is still young enough to be Hannibal's son, has spent years analyzing every battle, every maneuver, every tactical innovation that made the Carthaginian name synonymous with terror from the Pyrenees to the 7 hills of Rome. Across the plain, the Roman army deploys with the mechanical precision that has conquered half the known world. 40,000 men in perfect formation, their armor glinting like scales on some enormous serpent, their standards flying proudly in the morning breeze. But these are not the same legions that Hannibal had faced at Cannae. Those had fought with the confidence of men who believed their empire invincible. These soldiers have learned humility the hard way, taught by defeats that had driven them to adapt or die. More troubling still are the elephants in the Roman ranks, African beasts like his own, but trained by Numidian handlers who had once served Carthage and now rode under different banners. Massinissa had finally chosen his side in this ancient quarrel, bringing with him the finest light cavalry in the world and a bitter understanding of Carthaginian methods. The student had become the teacher, and today's lesson would be written in blood. Hannibal's own force is a patchwork quilt of loyalties and languages, held together by nothing more substantial than his personal authority and the promise of one last throw of the dice. Veterans of the Italian campaign march beside fresh recruits from Carthage, while Gallic mercenaries share ranks with Libyan spearmen who have never seen battle beyond the coastal raids. It is an army without unity, without the shared hardships that had forged his original force into something approaching invincibility. But it is what he has, and he has worked miracles with less. The night before the battle, unable to sleep under stars that seemed dimmer than he remembered, Hannibal had walked through his camp as was his custom. But instead of the confident murmur of veterans preparing for another victory, he had heard the whispered prayers of men who understood they were probably going to die. Some wrote letters to families they would never see again. Others simply stared into the dying embers of their fires, lost in memories of younger days when the future had seemed bright with promise. He had found himself standing before the tent of a boy from Carthage, barely old enough to carry a spear, his face still showing the soft curves of adolescence beneath the helmet that had belonged to his father. The child was weeping silently, tears that caught the firelight like scattered diamonds. "What troubles you, soldier?" Hannibal had asked, settling himself on the ground beside the boy with the easy familiarity that had always marked his relationship with his men. "I am afraid, sir," came the whispered reply. Not of dying, but of not being worthy of the men who marched with you across the mountains. They were giants, and I'm just... You're just what they were when they were your age, Hannibal had interrupted gently. Frightened boys pretending to be soldiers, hoping that courage would come when they needed it most. The difference between heroes and cowards is not the absence of fear, but what a man does despite being afraid. Now, as dawn painted the eastern sky the color of old blood, those words seemed hollow as pottery shards. Courage was all very well, but it could not change the mathematics of the situation. Scipio commanded superior numbers, better cavalry, more experienced troops, and, perhaps most importantly, the confidence that came from representing a power that had never learned to accept defeat as final. The battle began with the ritual exchange of missile fire, arrows and javelins arcing through the morning air like deadly rain. But Hannibal could see immediately that something was different about the Roman response to his opening moves. Where once his tactical innovations had surprised and disoriented his enemies, now they met each maneuver with a perfectly calculated counter-move. His elephant charge, which had broken so many enemy formations in the past, was absorbed and redirected with an efficiency that spoke of careful planning and thorough preparation. The great beasts, maddened by Roman horns and trumpets, turned back on their own formations, causing more chaos among Carthaginian ranks than Roman ones. His cavalry, once the terror of the ancient world, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Numidian horsemen who knew every trick that had ever been taught in Carthaginian service. Within an hour of the battle's beginning, Hannibal's flanks had been stripped away like bark from a tree, leaving his infantry isolated and vulnerable. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. As his center engaged with Roman legions that fought with the disciplined fury of men who had learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable, Hannibal began to recognize his own tactical innovations being used against him. The pincer movement that had destroyed armies from Spain to southern Italy was now being executed by Roman forces with the precision of clockwork. Scipio had not merely studied Hannibal's methods, he had perfected them, combining Carthaginian flexibility with Roman discipline to create something that was more dangerous than either tradition alone. It was like watching his own reflection in a dark mirror, seeing what his genius might have accomplished if it had been born in a Roman cradle and nurtured by Roman resources. The end, when it came, was not the dramatic collapse that poets would sing about, but the gradual erosion of hope that preceded all final defeats. Unit by unit, his army dissolved like salt in water. The Gallic mercenaries broke first, their loyalty exhausted by years of fighting other people's wars. Then the hastily recruited Carthaginians, brave but inexperienced, overwhelmed by enemies who fought with the methodical patience of men who had learned to trust their training more than their courage. Only the veterans of the Italian campaign held their ground, forming a final square around their general like petals around the heart of a dying flower. These were the men who had crossed the Alps, who had seen Rome tremble, who had followed him through 16 years of victories that had somehow added up to this moment of absolute defeat. They died as they had lived, without complaint, without surrender, without any expectation that their sacrifice would change the outcome of a battle that had been decided by forces larger than individual heroism. They died because they were soldiers, and soldiers fought until someone in authority told them to stop, and the only authority they recognized lay bleeding in the dust beside them. But Hannibal did not die at Zama. Perhaps it was providence, perhaps simple chance, perhaps the recognition by his enemies that some prizes were too valuable to be casually discarded. When the killing finally stopped and the crows began their feast, he found himself among the prisoners, wounded, defeated, but somehow still breathing in a world that had fundamentally changed around him. Scipio found him there as the sun was setting, turning the battlefield into a landscape of shadows and silhouettes. The young Roman general, for he was still young, despite the gravitas that command had given him, approached with the careful respect that one master accorded another. "It is finished," Scipio said, his voice carrying neither triumph nor mockery, only the flat certainty of mathematical proof. Hannibal looked up at his conqueror, this boy who had learned to dance his steps better than he himself could perform them, and nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely louder than the evening wind that stirred the dust of 20,000 dreams. "It is finished." The terror of Rome had danced his final dance. The lightning had finally exhausted itself against an enemy that had learned to bend rather than break, to adapt rather than merely endure. Tomorrow would bring negotiations, terms, the complex business of transforming military defeat into political reality. But tonight belonged to the dead, Roman and Carthaginian alike, who had paid the final price for the ambitions of living men. They lay together now in the democracy of death, their differences finally resolved, their dreams finally at peace. The dance was over, the music had stopped, and in the growing darkness of the African night, an age came quietly to its end. Twilight settles over the harbor of Carthage like a silk veil drawn across the face of a dying queen. The great ships that once carried the city's merchants to every corner of the Mediterranean now rest at anchor with their holds empty, their proud figureheads staring blindly across waters that have become foreign seas. 20 years have passed since Zama, 20 years of peace that taste like ashes in the mouths of those who remember, when Carthage commanded the waves and Roman senators spoke Carthaginian names in whispers. An old man sits alone on a terrace overlooking the harbor, his hair white as sea foam, his eyes holding the particular depth that comes to those who have seen too much of history's cruelty. Once, his presence could empty cities and set armies marching across continents. Now he commands nothing more than the servant who brings his evening wine and the memories that visit him each night as the sun dies behind the mountains of his homeland. Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, keeper of oaths and breaker of dreams, has grown old in the shadow of his own legend. The years since his return from Italy have been kind to his body. The wounds have healed, the scars have faded, the tremor in his left hand comes now from age, rather than the sword stroke that nearly killed him at Zama. But they have been less merciful to his spirit, which bears burdens that no surgeon can heal and no physician can treat. The Rome he failed to conquer has become master of the world he once thought he might reshape. Their legions march from Britain to the Euphrates, their language is spoken in marketplaces from Alexandria to Cadiz, their gods receive sacrifices in temples built from the stones of older faiths. The Mediterranean has become what Romans always claimed it was, a Roman lake, its every shore subject to the will of the 7 hills. Carthage endures but barely, like a tree that has been struck by lightning and somehow continues to produce leaves. The treaty signed after Zama had been generous by Roman standards. The city was allowed to survive, to govern its immediate territory, to continue the trade that had always been its lifeblood. But the great navy was gone, the empire dissolved, the dream of challenging Roman hegemony abandoned as completely as childhood toys. The young men of the city speak Latin now as fluently as Phoenician. They dress in Roman fashion, study Roman history, dream Roman dreams of advancement through service to Roman masters. The old ways persist in corners and shadows, kept alive by grandmothers who remember when Carthaginian ships ruled the waves, and grandfathers who still whisper the names of gods whose temples have been converted to other purposes. Sometimes when the wine has made him generous with his attention, visitors come seeking audiences with the man who had brought Rome to its knees. They are usually historians or aspiring generals, Romans mostly, who want to hear first-hand accounts of battles that have already become legend. They speak of tactics and strategy, of the genius that had turned defeat into victory time and again, of lessons that might be learned from the greatest military mind of their age. But they never ask the questions that matter most to him now. In these final years when mortality makes philosophers of even the most practical men, they never wonder what it costs a man to carry the hopes of his people across frozen mountains and through 16 years of endless war. They never inquire about the price of keeping promises made to dead fathers, or the weight of dreams that prove too large for any mortal to bear. Tonight's visitor is different. Marcus Claudius Marcellus the Younger has come not seeking military wisdom, but something more elusive, an understanding of how great men learn to live with the consequences of their greatness. His own grandfather had earned the title Sword of Rome, fighting against Hannibal's forces in Italy, and the young man carries questions that go deeper than tactical discussions. "Tell me," he asks as they share wine that comes from vineyards planted long before either of them was born, "do you regret it? The crossing, the campaign, all of it?" It is the question that Hannibal has been asking himself for 20 years, and he still has no simple answer. How could he regret the adventure that had made his name immortal, the campaign that had demonstrated what was possible when human will was pushed beyond its apparent limits? Yet how could he not regret the cost, the thousands who had died in service to his vision, the homeland that had been impoverished by his ambitions, the future that had been mortgaged to pay for dreams of past glory? "I regret the necessity," he says finally, his voice carrying the weight of years spent contemplating the mathematics of might have been. "I regret that the world was arranged in such a way that a small boy felt compelled to swear an oath that would consume his life. I regret that Rome and Carthage could not find a way to share the Mediterranean without one devouring the other. But not the attempt itself? Never the attempt. When I was young, the world seemed full of possibilities that had never been tried. Mountains that had never been crossed, battles that had never been fought, victories that had never been won. How could a man live with himself if he did not test the boundaries of the possible? The harbor below them is quiet now, its usual bustle reduced to the gentle lapping of waves against stone and the occasional cry of a seabird settling for the night. But Hannibal's memory peoples it with ghosts, the ships that had carried his father's ambitions, the merchants who had traded in every corner of the known world, the naval battles that had once decided the fate of nations. "There is something else," Marcellus says, his voice dropping to the tone that men use when they approach subjects too important for casual conversation. "Word has come from Rome. There are those in the Senate who grow nervous about your continued presence here, who whisper that old lions should not be left alive to teach young cubs how to hunt." It is not unexpected news. Hannibal has been living on borrowed time since the day he returned from Italy, kept alive by Roman confidence and Carthaginian weakness in equal measure. But empires, he has learned, are jealous of their security, and even defeated enemies eventually become inconvenient when their very existence reminds subject peoples that Rome is not invincible. "How long do I have?" he asks, though the answer hardly matters. A man does not live to 73 by accident. Every year beyond 60 has been a gift, every day a small victory over the ordinary mortality that claims most soldiers long before their hair turns white. Perhaps a season. Perhaps less. There are those who counsel patience, but others who argue that legends grow more dangerous with age, not less. Hannibal nods, accepting the verdict with the same equanimity he had brought to every other reversal of fortune. Death, after all, was simply the final tactical problem to be solved, and he had been preparing for this particular challenge since the day he first drew sword in anger. The conversation turns to other matters: philosophy, poetry, the peculiar Roman fascination with engineering projects that seem designed more to impress posterity than serve practical purposes. But underneath it all runs the current of finality, the understanding that this is likely the last such evening either of them will enjoy. When Marcellus finally takes his leave, walking down the hill toward the Roman quarter where he maintains a villa befitting his family's station, Hannibal remains on his terrace, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. They are the same stars that had watched him cross the Alps, that had witnessed his victories and defeats, that would continue their ancient dance long after his name was forgotten and his bones had returned to the dust from which they came. Somewhere to the north, beyond ranges of hills and vast stretches of sea, Rome sleeps behind its walls, secure now in its mastery, confident in its destiny, no longer troubled by nightmares of Carthaginian elephants trumpeting their rage across frozen passes. The terror that had once made strong men tremble at the mention of his name has faded into history, becoming just another chapter in the long story of Roman triumph over barbarian ambition. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is sufficient that for 16 years, the most powerful empire in the world had been forced to acknowledge that it was not invincible, that its eagles could be brought down, that its apparent destiny was subject to the same uncertainties that governed all human endeavors. The oath sworn in a temple in Carthage has been kept, even if not in the way a young boy had imagined. Rome had learned to fear, even if it had never learned to yield. The lightning that bore his name had illuminated possibilities that would inspire other dreamers in other ages, other young men who would look at seemingly impossible obstacles and wonder what might happen if someone simply refused to accept impossibility. As the night deepens around him, and the harbor settles into the profound quiet that comes only to places where great events have run their course, Hannibal Barca closes his eyes and lets memory carry him back across the years, to Spain and Gaul and the Alpine passes where everything had seemed possible, to Italian battlefields where Roman eagles had learned to fall, to the moment when a small boy had placed his hand on warm stone and promised to become the lightning that would split the Roman. Oak! The weight of memory is heavy, heavier than armor, heavier than the years that have bent his shoulders and silvered his hair. But it is a burden he has learned to carry with dignity, understanding at last that some promises are too large for any one life to fulfill completely, but worth keeping nonetheless for the attempt itself. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own choices between courage and prudence, honor and survival. But tonight belongs to memory, to the ghosts of brave men who had followed him beyond the edge of the known world, to dreams that had burned bright enough to illuminate the darkness, even in defeat. The terror of Rome rests at last, his storms finally spent, his lightning finally earthed. But somewhere in the distance, thunder still rumbles across the mountains, and the echo of his name will outlive empires. In the harbor below, the waves whisper against ancient stones, carrying secrets that only the sea remembers, singing lullabies that speak of journeys ended and voyages yet to come. The story is finished. The dreamer sleeps, and history holds its breath for the next lightning to split the sky. Close your eyes now, and let these ancient voices carry you into the gentle darkness. Rest well, dreamer of impossible things. Rest well.